welcome to this evening's book review. Our review today is of Ross King's book, Brunelleschi's Dome. And it will not be a surprise to any of you that I am delighted to welcome James Cooke, the loveliest man in the world, and of course my husband. James, darling, over to you.
I think it's the secret of a happy marriage. Volunteer to do a book club talk. It's amazing how it works. It works wonders. It's lovely to see you all. Wow, what a terrific audience. Brunelleschi's Dome. Philip Brunelleschi died in Florence on April the 15th, 1446. He was 69 years old. A bachelor, Pippo, as everyone called him, had lived his life in his parents' home beside the cathedral Santa Maria del Fiore. By the way, this is going to be a fully paid talk paid by the Italian tourist agency. If you don't want to go to Florence at the end of this, just pack up. And this is going to crop up again and again. Santa Maria del Fiore, Our Lady of the Flowers. His nickname, Pippo, was perhaps the only endearing thing about him. He was short, bald, pugnacious, a fighter, with a broken aquiline nose, thin lips, and a weak chin. Dirty and disheveled, this is his death mask, a fully paid-up member of the seemingly never-ending line of unkempt artists that would transform Italy and art in the 14th and 15th centuries. The list starts off with Cimabue, a Florentine, painting around 1290. And no looker he. The name Cimabue means ox head. And his student, Giotto, was little better. Boccaccio devoted a short story in the Decameron to him, marveling at how nature had frequently planted such genius in men so monstrously ugly. Indifferent to the state of their dress, artists such as these, and including Brunelleschi, the center of our story today, would go for months on end without changing their clothes. The ugly, eccentric artist image would become the norm to such a degree that the painter and architect Vasari, himself an uncouth, with a skin disease and notably dirty and unkempt fingernails, would marvel that Raphael could at once be so great an artist and at the same time so handsome and elegant. Vasari, poet, artist, and architect, was writing some 100 years later in the middle of the 16th century, having just completed the enclosed corridor that runs over the shops and rooftops of the Ponte Vecchio and joins the Uffizi and Pizzi palaces, and was used by the later Dukes of Medici as their private thoroughfare from the bank offices one side of the Arno to their homes on the other. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to the 1400s. Brunelleschi's father, a notary, had intended that he'd become a civil servant, but instead he became a goldsmith. Then, at the peak of their reputation for ingenuity. Ingenuity is a word that will feature in the talk today. Goldsmiths were the princes amongst artisans. They could decorate a manuscript with gold leaf, set precious stones, cast metal, work with enamel, and engrave silver. And it's no coincidence that sculptors such as Della Robbia and Donatello, painters such as Uccello, Verrocchio, Leonardo da Vinci, and Gozzoli, all trained as goldsmiths. And I'm throwing these names around because I'll return to them all again in a moment. Back to our hero today and to Ross King's Brunelleschi's Dome. Secret, defensive, paranoid, Pippo lived alone and worked on the completion of the Great Dome for nearly half his life. The lantern at the summit was consecrated by Cardinal Anthony, later Saint Anthony, only 1 month before Pippo died in 1446. In the previous 30 years, from 1416, Brunelleschi had written his name in architecture's Hall of Fame and become arguably the core of a new movement in art. and all Florence knew it. His funeral was the first ever held for an ordinary citizen in the great cathedral. The body lay in state beneath the vast dome he had completed a few years earlier. Thousands of mourners paid their dues, and when the candles were finally snuffed on May the 15th, he was entombed there in his cathedral. The only other person interred, Saint Zenobius, the first bishop of Florence. Like much of his architecture, Pipo's tomb was so severe in design, so unpretentious, so unostentatious, as to go unnoticed for centuries, until it was rediscovered during archaeological work on the cathedral in 1972. It was identified by a one-line inscription: Corpus Magni Ingeni Viri Filippi Brunelleschi Florenti. Here lies the body of the great ingenious man, Filippi Brunelleschi of Florence. The simple words spoke to the enormity of the little man. He was 5'4" high, and of the extraordinary time and place. I've used the word ingenuity before. We were describing goldsmiths. The word in Latin includes echoes of meaning associated with engines, the military, and ultimately with genius. The ability to unravel, understand, and make work the unimaginable and unworkable. And look at the pride in that last word, Florenti. There is nothing more to be said than that he came from Florence. It's written there with the same pride that most of you take in being an American. No more, no less. That's it. Never underestimate it, and never take it for granted. My chief interest today is to give you my take on both the Renaissance and Brunelleschi's singular importance, almost as a symbol of that movement. So before we go any further, let's just stand back for a minute and reflect. I've mentioned a roll call of the greatest artists of the 14th and 15th centuries: Brunelleschi, also Cimabue, Giotto, Boccaccio, Vasari, della Robbia. Here's one of his secular masterpieces, fashioned in his secret process and using the clay from the Arno that flows through the city. Donatello, that's his harrowing, empathetic rendering of Mary Magdalene. Uccello, his Battle of San Romano. Leonardo da Vinci, and my favorite, Gozzoli. And I could add Dante and Petrarch. All came with pride from Florence, or the immediate villages around the city walls. And they came with a pride in the Republic of Florence, so great that a century later, Michelangelo, yes, he too was a Florentine, would ensure that his corpse would be smuggled back to his hometown in a bale of wool after the great man died in Rome. Vasari relates how the corpse miraculously showed no sign of putrefaction 25 days after his death, when it was finally buried in the Basilica di Santa Croce, about 500 yards from the cathedral. And all of this, and I still haven't mentioned Ghiberti or Masaccio, all this in a town in the 1400s, roughly the size of Vero Beach and St. Sebastian, a population of barely 50,000. No wonder visitors go to Florence to eat steak Florentine and to drink the great wines of modern-day Tuscany. What food did they eat to become so great? Indulge me here, please, because I want to share some of the spirit of the times with you. And did they like their food? Here is Boccaccio in 1350, writing in the Decameron, fantasizing about food in his beloved town. In our region, where they tie the vines with sausages, and where one can buy a goose for a farthing and a gosling included, there is a mountain made of grated Parmigiana cheese on which men work all day, making pasta and ravioli, cooking them in capon's broth, and who grabs most eats most. Wonderful stuff. Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King is one of those rare books that pushes the reader to find out more, to ask why, how. He wrote it in 2000, and it lit a touch paper of inquiry in my mind that's been fizzing ever since. I wanted to know more about the Renaissance. I wanted to know what happened. Why Florence? Why then? And the answers to all of this eventually swirl around Brunelleschi and his cathedral. Here it is with the campanile, or bell tower, designed by Giotto, and the baptistry with Ghiberti's gates. And then from the ground, a smashed together collection of great architecture, unmatched till modern day New York. And just as New York is built on trade, wealth, and above all banking, so now is the time to introduce a new name, Giovanni de' Medici, the founding father of the Bank of Medici. The Renaissance is the story of wealth and great art, of extraordinary architecture cramped together in the center of Florence. And also it's the story behind these buildings, one of which is not in the center in the midst of all this wealth. And this is the Basilica di Santa Croce, where Michelangelo desired to be buried, where Giotto painted his epic set of 16 contemplative frescoes and began it all in the largest Franciscan church in the world. Because ultimately, the Renaissance is only partly and indirectly about art. It's really about God. It's about God and about a new human interpretation of men's relationship to God. And therefore about a resounding and wholly fresh inspiration, a newfound joy and satisfaction in being and feeling human. Artists of all shapes and sizes broke from the cramping thought police of the traditional church, from the Latin Mass, to a world of everyday beauty and reality, to just living, to the genius of being ordinary, and the conclusion that everything can be explained, everything can be understood, and everything can be thrilling. It's no coincidence that the move from Latin mattered, and it was the language of Tuscany, of Florence, of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante that would become the language of the Renaissance and eventually of Italy itself. And of course, like any other successful movement, it also needed wealth. Wealth, talent, and God, the three imperatives of great change. And let's take God first. It all began in the 12th century in the tiny hill town of Assisi, ironically not in the Florentine Republic, just a few miles south, just over the border in Umbria. This isn't the time and place for a detailed account of the life and work of Giovanni Bernardone, later known as St. Francis. This is the Basilica from the hills. St. Francis, the founder of the Franciscan order. This is the Giotto painted portrait of the saint from the 1300s. It would be the Franciscan friars who more than any others walked in poverty and would spread the life-changing notion that mankind was born in the image of God, that we were in this world to live our lives according to the New Testament, to enjoy this life, to do good, live well, and then move on to heaven. This was new, refreshing, and liberating, a distinct move from the threatening world of early Christianity. And make no mistake, art was transformed with a new brilliance. Here is Giotto again, but this time not in Florence, in Padua, 1305. The itinerant friars spread the new word in the local language of Tuscany at a time when Italy, and Florence in particular, were enjoying a social transformation. Venice, Milan, and Florence were thriving on a combination of seaborne trade, a textile boom, and the sudden explosion of banking. Florence grew rapidly as workers moved in growing numbers from the fields to the city to work at the textile and dyeing businesses on the banks of the Arno. The Franciscans took Christ's message to this new urban mass, huddled in the shanty towns around the city gates. Hence the scale of the Franciscan churches, such as Santa Croce, built for hundreds. This was to be a large working place to accommodate the masses who came to hear the friars preach, and built typically on the edge of towns to reach out to the new congregations. St. Francis himself was an artist, and he promoted a felt, tangible, rather than reasoned and abstract faith. The story goes that he was the originator of the Christmas crib scene that we see in our shops as a means of emphasizing Christ at his most vulnerable, the human dimension of the great biblical birthday story. Here's a Della Robbia take on the theme. And this refreshing approach to faith led in turn to a new dynamic in art, a new humanness, a new physicality. And nowhere was this development seen more quickly than in Florence, or more clearly than in the changing style of sculptors over the next century. Let's start with three: Nicholas Pisano, his son Giovanni, and then finally Donatello. Nicholas's carving here dates around 1250. It's before the Renaissance begins, and it's modelled on Roman sarcophagi, heavy-bodied, leaden-footed, almost static, impassive. Look at the Roman face of Mary there and the heroic stance of the horses. Just 50 years later, see the far more fluid, almost rampant nativity of his son Giovanni. It's on the pulpit of Pisa Cathedral. Look at the humour of the donkey. Forgotten where the donkey is now. There in the middle. And the sheep. And just to lay before you the whole development, compare that with Donatello's statue of the crazed prophet Habakkuk, designed for Florence's bell tower, or his erotic David. Both 50 years later, as the Renaissance liberalism fully took hold. The Franciscan friars spread the new word of God. Florence provided a growing source of wealth and pride, and the artists responded with a new naturalism. A word about the wealth, in part founded on textiles, but with an increasing focus on banking, to a large extent an Italian invention. The English word derives from the Italian banco, the counters on which the bankers first conducted their trade. Loaning out on interest, despite the church's ban on usury. When the Sienese banks collapsed, Florence, with its symbol of the lily, became the centre to such an extent in the early 1350s that its own currency, the Fiorino d'Oro, a gold coin stamped with the lily, became the first standard currency used throughout Europe and known the world over as the florin. Within this banking world, gradually one family began to dominate the scene. The founding head, Giovanni de' Medici. And it was he who cemented the initial preeminence of the house that would be forever linked to the Renaissance, eventually with expanded offices through Europe to London and to Bruges. Cautious, unpretentious, slow-moving, Giovanni was careful to be at one with the local citizenry and to honour the republic unique to the governance of the city. On his deathbed, he spoke to his son Cosimo. The Della Signoria, by the way, was the Florentine equivalent of Wall Street. Here it's depicted at the execution of Savonarola. And he said to him, never hang around the Della Signoria looking for business. Go there only when summoned. Only accept office bestowed on you. Never make a show before the people and never go against the will of the Republic. God and his Cathedral of Our Lady of the Flowers, you can just see it there, overlooking the square. Wealth, the Medici Bank, within the village of Florence, and a sudden explosion of artistic genius, all taking place within the New York equivalent of 1 or 2 blocks of each other. And at the center of this refined and close network is Brunelleschi. A polymath, Pippo mastered the skills of the goldsmith, studied the science of gears, designed clocks, and invented the first alarm clock. Like most others, he picked up on the humanism, pushing the envelope, challenging processes, and gradually moving away from the traditional church to the more secular. But none of them ever quite leave the church. None really move on. And no more did the bankers. The Medici would go on to become bankers to the popes, and part at least of their local philanthropy would be down to winning pardons for their sins, expiating the sin above all of usury. But just in case any of you are becoming worried at all this moral virtue, you'll be relieved to know that gradually the Florentines worked out the moral conflict and took a more tolerant, pragmatic, even New Yorker attitude to wealth. Here is Stephen Boccari in 1400. Whence, and he was talking to the Parliament of the time in Florence, whence are our houses and palaces procured? From riches. Whence comes our clothes? Whence the meals of our children? From riches. These great churches, these decorations, walls, towers, defences, your palaces and your dwellings, the bridges are very streets. With what have you built, if not with riches? Despite all this new certainty, the bankers hedged their bets. At his death in 1464, Cosimo, the first son, here painted by Pontormo, estimated he'd spent more than 600,000 gold florins on public works in his city. By my reckoning, something of the order of $1.5 billion in today's purchasing power. That's even if you could lay your hands on a Donatello. It was Cosimo who commissioned the statue of David. Or even if you could find a Leonardo to do your bidding. If there is a lesson for our times, it's never to underestimate other nations. This little Italian village in 1400 was some place. And then, in the summer of 1400, 12,000 Florentines died, about 1 in 5, from the Black Death, the plague. And in an almost pagan effort to placate the deity, the Guild of Wool Merchants decided to sponsor a new set of doors for the 11th century octagonal baptistry, just across from the cathedral. As with other baptistries, the 8 sides were symbolic of the resurrection. Christ rising from the grave on the 8th day after entering Jerusalem. Many baptismal fonts have 8 sides as an echo of the same great biblical moment. And this was meant to be Brunelleschi's first public triumph. But right at the last, the competition committee dithered, changed its mind, fell between all the stools, and appointed both Brunelleschi and his arch rival, Ghiberti, another young goldsmith with whom he had trained and studied. They were each given £75 of bronze and 1 year to plan the gates. And by a miracle, the 2 winning designs have survived. You can see them today side by side in the Bargello Museum in Florence. That's Ghiberti on the left, Brunelleschi on the right. Furious at being awarded only half his dues, the already irascible and stubborn Pippo walked out and set off for Rome, leaving the field to his rival. Ghiberti set to for most of his life, completing not 1 but 2 sets of gates for the baptistry, thought by many, including Michelangelo, to be one of the crowning achievements of the Renaissance. Pippo, meanwhile, studied the ancient ruins in a Rome now ravaged by time, looting, invasions, and the plague. He took with him one of his own students, no less than the 15-year-old Donatello. You know, I can think of no other time when so much genius was concentrated so closely together. Ghiberti making the baptistry gates with Uccello as an apprentice in his workshop. Brunelleschi working with Donatello, who will make the cathedral statues, and with Della Robbio due to work on most of Brunelleschi's buildings, Giotto designing the campanili, all within 1 block of each other, all within touching distance of the Medici Bank. A constellation of talent, like Palo Alto in San Francisco today. And come to think of it, here's an inspired thought. San Francisco is, of course, named after St. Francis, and it's twinned with Assisi, where it all began. That's as good a portent as I can find for you in America today. Palo Alto, Florence, and the Renaissance, and Assisi. But his time away was no Roman holiday for Brunelleschi. He stayed there on and off for 13 years, living amongst the ruins like a vagabond, studying dimensions, design, how to make concrete, but above all, the design of the then 1,000-year-old Pantheon with its vast, unsupported dome. The trip was no random accident. The foundation stone of Florence's cathedral had been laid more than a century earlier in 1296. Completion had been delayed by wars, the plague, and the need to pay bills. But above all, it had been delayed because, amazing as it may seem, no one knew how to complete the building. A dome had been designed, approved, and a dome it would have to be. But as I say, no one knew how to do it. This was meant to start 170 feet up and to rise to over 250 feet. You could stick the Parthenon inside it. Saint Maria del Fiore was to be a wonder of the world with an unsupported dome reaching across 143 feet of space, if only somebody could build it. The original designs agreed by the Guild of Wool Merchants had become by now an unchangeable subject of veneration. The cathedral, meanwhile, was a vast space without a roof open to the elements. So in desperation, once again, a competition to complete the work, and armed with his notebook from Rome, Pippo was ready. Like the no less paranoid Leonardo 100 years later, remember in the 14th century there were no patent laws, his notebooks were crammed with mathematical formulae, designs and research, all in code, all secret, and all back to front. Brunelleschi, the polymath, returned to Florence, famous for his temper, for his ingenuity, and one other remarkable skill. He had rediscovered the secret of perspective, and apart from everything else, was about to transform painting and sculpture. Brunelleschi brought about a seismic shift in Western art. For all his temper and paranoia, so close-knit was this Palo Alto-like world of Florence that his immediate impact can be seen on the work of his most keen competitor, on Ghiberti, and on those gates. Just look again at Ghiberti's first effort, and then compare it with the perspective of the final version, or the subject of Jacob and Isaac panel, both made months after Brunelleschi came back from Rome. Now, Brunelleschi and his team, remember including Della Robbia and Donatello, responded to the competition for the dome with a model 6 feet by 10 feet, big enough to walk in, and were met by a deafening silence of astonishment. There were no columns. How would it ever hold up? And eventually, like a slow-moving car crash, the committee dithered its way for 2 years between Brunelleschi and yet again Ghiberti. Ghiberti, by now rich and famous, got on with his doors and the many commissions that had brought to him. And Brunelleschi, he changed the face of architecture. He designed and built his first tour de force, a hospital for abandoned children, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, which showcased the expertise he had brought from Rome. Introduced an entirely new severity, even spirituality of design and totality of conception. No Byzantine icons and gold leaf. This is the Church of Santa Maria in the south in Palermo. No vast murals of God. Now the only decoration, the play of light on the uniquely balanced dimensions of the building. Here's the cloistered walkway and the simple courtyard. And here I've tried to show you the mathematical basis of the design. interrupted only by a sequence of roundels and plaques created by Della Robbia and Brunelleschi himself. He went on to design the Church of the Sacred Spirit. The design is dominant, masterful, austere, severe, and total. No room for decorative paintings, no pictures of God. Instead, repeatedly and softly illuminated by sunlight through clear windows and an oculus is a powerful sense of limitless shapes, curves, lines, shadows, nothing to distract one man or woman's contemplation of themselves and the spirit. And throughout, as you walk quietly through the building, a complex of pilasters, capitals, rosettes, corbels, and window frames, all carved almost as an abstraction in the cool grey stone of Florence. The Ospedale and the new church brought Brunelleschi at last into close contact with the Medici. Giovanni was the chairman of the Wool Merchant Committee, and the canny elder banker and Pippo struck up a strange and lasting friendship. Unable to choose an outright winner, fearful that Brunelleschi's model could in fact be built, the wool merchants yet again shared the prizes between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, and on this occasion only agreed to pay the money after completion. Ghiberti, nonplussed by the scale of the demands involved, backed away. Ross King goes into detail explaining the sequence of ingenious breakthroughs fundamental to delivering the building. 3 stick out in my mind. Remember, the masons were working on the project and starting every day at least 170 feet up. The first is that the dome is in fact 2 domes in one. The outer, a protective shell, then an internal walkway, a staircase, before the internal, more lightweight ceiling dome itself. Here's another depiction. The second is that the bricks are laid throughout in a self-reinforcing herringbone fashion, using lightweight Roman-style concrete as mortar, and each brick is separately shaped to an inward-sloping angle of 30 degrees. There are no shortcuts. They're building the largest vaulted brick ceiling in the world, brick by brick, inch by inch, and it's going to take 16 years. And the third is this extraordinary concept of a regular chain of aged oak and stone that goes around the circumference of the roof like a supporting strap, like a belt, to hold in the weight of the massive dome. Brunelleschi filled his notebooks with inventions, innovations, and adaptations as he wrestled with the engineering challenge. Scaffolding, gears, levers, lifting equipment. No one knew how to lift bricks in bulk to such heights, let alone the great slabs of stone, some weighing up to 1,700 pounds, and they had to lift them to those great heights with precise accuracy. It took a year to make the hoist, which included the first known example of reverse gear. That's Leonardo da Vinci's sketch. He was a young apprentice working on the project at the time. Pippo brought in the shipyards of Pisa, the only people capable of making a rope 600 feet in length. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about 1400, the triumph of a new can-do spirit, the Renaissance genius for innovation, and still the largest stone dome in the world. Let me just go over this achievement with a little help of our visual.
At the time, domes were often built as semicircles. But the town fathers required that Brunelleschi build an 8-sided dome that would be even taller and stronger. It would also have no central support system to hold it up during construction. Even worse, the dome's base was an imprecise octagon with no true center. But Brunelleschi had that covered. There would be 2 domes instead of 1, an inner and an outer shell, held together by giant brick arches and interlocking rings of stone and wood. The rings would work like hoops on a barrel, keeping the dome from expanding outward. To move heavy loads hundreds of feet up, Brunelleschi designed ingenious new machines, including an ox-driven hoist and massive lifting devices far ahead of their time. So, revolutionary design? Check. Groundbreaking engineering? Check. Can-do attitude? Check. But with no central support system, how would he actually build it? First off, the masonry would have to support itself during construction. To do this, Brunelleschi placed the bricks in a herringbone pattern, which spiraled to the top of the dome, with vertical bricks acting as bookends to hold the others in place. They laid about 1 row a week, giving the mortar time to cure. At this rate, the dome grew at a snail's pace of about a foot a month. But perhaps most puzzling is how he was able to place the bricks with such precision.
Hey!
Many experts agree that he used guide ropes. One theory states that ropes ran from a flower pattern on the work platform that showed exactly where the bricks should go. Another has ropes running from the dome's center, tracing a series of cones that grew smaller as they ascended to the top. Still another suggests a different arrangement of central ropes and wooden templates. However it was done, it worked. The 8 faces of the dome met at the top precisely, just as Brunelleschi had planned. In all, it took 16 years to complete the dome. When he died in 1446, Brunelleschi left behind no sketches and no details as to exactly how he achieved his masterpiece. Today, it remains the largest masonry dome in the world, more than 500 years after it was built.
I hope that helps you to understand it, because the book goes on and on and on about how the bricks were laid, and I, for one, certainly was more confused at the end than I was when I began. But perhaps most unexpected, and certainly least described by Ross King, is the evidence of Pippo's powers of leadership. Gradually he'd won the confidence of the wool merchants, but now his leadership of those bricklayers and masons was to be tested. As you saw in the little movie, each brick had its own place, its own angle, and laying the bricks meant the brickie was effectively working ever further out into a void some 250 feet over the stone floor of the cathedral. And it's a testament to the care that Pippo took by way of discipline, safety harnesses, supporting walkways, supplies of food and drink. There was only one fatality in 16 years, as hundreds of men responded to the challenge of a new era of precision bricklaying. And I want to thank here Emmett and Kathy Harty for writing to me the other day. Theirs is a really superb film, not just some graphics, and it's on YouTube by National Geographic. It examines a great deal of the detail of how this worked, and you actually see them building. If anybody wants to know about the movie, just send me an email and I'll send them a link. This Franciscan-inspired spirit of untrammeled discovery and invention, of indomitable determination to excel, was to become a characteristic of the Renaissance. De la Robbia had invented a secret way to produce white-fired clay. Ghiberti was inventing ways to cast massive bronzes. Artists from Giotto to Leonardo would experiment in new forms of paint, perspective, and portraiture, and all worked within yards, even as part of the Brunelleschi triumph. The dome was consecrated in 1436. It remained to tile the outer surface with dazzling terracotta, fired earth from the clay from the banks of the Arno, and to build and fit the lantern. And as with everything else that Brunelleschi did, this was no insignificant little belfry or piece of flummery. Octagonal in shape, remember the 8 days of Christ's resurrection. Its 8 buttresses align perfectly with the 8 ribs of the dome and support 30-foot high pillars crowned with Corinthian capitals that in turn are enclosing 30-foot-high windows. The whole topped off by an 8-foot bronze sphere forged in the Florentine workshops of Verrocchio, aided by his young apprentice goldsmith, yet again Leonardo da Vinci. In all, the lantern weighed 1 million pounds. And as you would expect by now, Pippo responded with new inspiration, the device to raise the components 360 feet and put them accurately in place. The dome was completed just in time to support Cosimo de' Medici's greatest achievement. In 1439, the city became host to an historical ecumenical council. The split between the Roman and Byzantine churches went back to Rome itself. In part, it gave rise to the Fourth Crusade. But now the leaders of the two Christian churches wanted to get together. This was big. A Camp David writ large. The d'Este family pushed for Ferrara to the north, between Venice and Florence. But a cold winter, the plague, and the sheer cost of hosting all the leaders of Christendom left the door open to Florence, the Medici, and the spectacular setting of the newly completed cathedral. Just a word about this amazing set of Gozzoli paintings. In the background, the paintings at this time are almost always literal. Everybody here is somebody that's been copied. This is Cosimo, and this is his family behind him. This is the future leader of the Medici family. And they're going on a large walk, from anybody who knows it, Ferrara. And that's almost a literal depiction of the great fortress at the center of Ferrara, the fortress of the d'Este family. It was a triumph. And this is the Holy Roman Empire, the Emperor of Byzantium. He changed the face of fashion in Florence. All the ladies went berserk about this kit here, and it became the new fashion of the time. Brunelleschi's dome was wondered at, and the Medici cemented their role as the bankers to the Pope. Pippo dies 3 years later. Much was still to come. The Medici Bank and the Franciscan friars would take the message of humanism throughout Europe. Printing began in 1440, the year after the Ecumenical Council, with the publication of the Gutenberg Bible. Leonardo was still to come. Here is his Annunciation, thought to be his earliest surviving painting, and note the visual double entendre, his use of the lily, the symbol of the Virgin Mary, and of course also of Florence. And here, my favorite secular Leonardo, the woman with ermine, simply because I couldn't leave it out. I can't think of anything to say about it, it's just lovely. We've come a long way. Art and architecture, engineering had all been transformed, and it all started in this little town where wealth, a cornucopia of talent, and the teachings of St. Francis had come together in a few streets around a cathedral and the inspired genius of one rather crotchety old man. Ross King's book really doesn't touch on much of this, but he started me off on a real journey of discovery that I couldn't resist. In summing up, let me just leave the final word to yet another great from the Florence of the 1430s, Leon Alberti, humanist, author, architect, and poet, the epitome polymath of the Renaissance, writing in 1434 as the dome neared its completion above his beloved city. I used to grieve, he wrote to a friend, that nature had grown old and tired. She no longer produced genius or giants, but I have since returned to Florence, our city, great above all others. And I've come to see how in Pippo Brunelleschi, in our friend Donato Donatello, and others like Ghiberti, there is indeed genius for every praiseworthy enterprise. Brunelleschi created a new architecture, was a great engineer, invented the alarm clock, and held together a team of geniuses around a small square in Florence where they did their bit to change the world. We too have come a long way today, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you.